Before the Knights Templar rode under their red cross, before whispers of hidden brotherhoods and secret bloodlines stirred the imagination of Europe, there was another story older, stranger, and wrapped in mist. It begins in a time when the Roman Empire was crumbling and the world seemed to shift beneath people's feet, when new powers rose from the shadows and old gods faded into memory. It is the story of kings who carried their right to rule, not just in crowns, but in every strand of their long, uncut hair. Kings said to heal with the touch. Kings whose very birth was surrounded by whispers of something not entirely human. They were called the Merovingians. To some, they were simply the first kings of France. To others, they were something more, the keepers of a secret, the guardians of an ancient code, a bloodline that some believe was sacred, a bloodline that would one day entwine with the legends of the Templars and the Grail itself. Tonight, we go back before the Crusades, before the Templars, before the stories you think you know. We go back to the beginning, to the cold shores of the North Sea, to the rise of the long-haired kings, to a whisper that has drifted through history for more than 1,000 years. This is the Merovingian Code, the bloodline before the Templars. One before the red cross of the Templars was ever stitched onto white cloaks, before crusaders marched eastward, before whispers of secret societies and hidden bloodlines filled Europe's imagination. There was another story, older, stranger, softer, like something carried on the breath of the wind. It is a story that does not begin with swords and castles, but with mist and whispers, with legends told in flickering firelight, and with the slow birth of a dynasty that would shape the world and haunt it with mystery for centuries to come. This is the story of the Merovingians, the bloodline before the Templars. Imagine the world 1,500 years ago. The Western Roman Empire, once mighty and unshakable, was falling apart. Its roads were broken, its cities hollowed out, its legions scattered. The marble halls that had echoed with power now stood empty, their statues crumbling under vines. Across that ruined landscape, new powers began to rise, not from the order of emperors, but from the chaos left behind. Among them were the Franks, fierce and restless, tribes that lived in the shadows of Rome, sometimes its allies, sometimes its enemies, but always watching. From these scattered people came a whisper, the whisper of a king, and of a bloodline unlike any other. The story begins with a queen, a cold sea, and a legend so strange it feels more like a dream than history. Long ago, the wife of a Frankish chieftain named Clodio walked along the gray edge of the North Sea. The wind was sharp, the horizon a blur of fog and foam. She stepped into the water, and there, the story says, she met something or someone. Some called it a beast. Some called it a god. Some called it the Kinator, a creature of the deep with 5 horns, its shape impossible to imagine, its nature impossible to name. The legend does not explain what happened in those waters. It only tells us that the queen returned to shore changed. In time, she carried a child. That child was Merovech. Merovech would give his name to the line that followed him, the Merovingians, but he gave them something more powerful than a name. He gave them a story, the idea that their blood was touched by something other than mortal flesh. Was the Kinator real? Was it a god of the old pagan world, a monster from the depths, or just a tale made to veil a scandal? No one can say. But the legend endured, and with every telling, it gave the Merovingians an aura that no sword or crown could match. Merovech himself became a leader of the Salian Franks, a war chief who fought battles and made alliances, but it was his descendants who turned his name into power. His son Childeric would be remembered as a king, and centuries later, when his grave was opened, it held golden bees, rings, weapons treasures buried to honor a man who had ruled not just by might, but by myth. But it was Childeric's son who would change everything. Clovis, Clovis came to the throne in 481, only 15 years old, a boy, but already a king in the eyes of his people. He inherited a world of shifting borders, rival warlords, and fragile loyalties. And yet, by the end of his life, he had done something extraordinary. He united the Franks, forging a kingdom from the broken pieces of what Rome had left behind. But his most powerful act was not won on the battlefield. Clovis married a Christian queen named Clotilde. She begged him to leave behind the old gods, the spirits of rivers and trees, the thunderous deities of war. For a long time he refused, but then came a battle, fierce and desperate. Clovis prayed, not to his ancestors' gods, but to hers. He promised that if the Christian God granted him victory, he would convert. He won, and true to his word, he kept his promise. On a cold Christmas day, sometime around the year 496, Clovis was baptized in Reims. The moment has been told and retold, and with each telling, it has grown into legend. They say that as the sacred oil ran low, a white dove descended from the sky, carrying a vial of chrism from heaven itself. That oil, the holy ampulla, would anoint the kings of France for centuries to come. Was it true, or was it only a story? Perhaps it doesn't matter, because from that moment on, Clovis was not only a conqueror, he was a Christian king, a king blessed by heaven. Yet even as the Merovingians embraced the cross, they never fully lost the older, stranger aura that surrounded them. They became known as the long-haired kings. Their hair was never cut. It might sound like a detail, a custom, but to the Franks it was sacred. Their long, flowing hair was the sign of their right to rule, as much a crown as any band of gold. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to take away his power, to strip him of the very essence of his kingship. There are stories of kings dethroned not by swords, but by shears. A few strokes of a blade, and a ruler became a man with no claim. And there was another whisper, softer but enduring. It was said that the Merovingian kings could heal with a touch, that their hands carried some gift or some grace that could ease the suffering of the sick. Was it magic, faith, or simply the hope of desperate people? Perhaps it was all three, but the belief gave the Merovingians something even greater than fear. It gave them devotion. By the time Clovis died in 511, the Merovingian kingdom stretched across much of what we now call France and Germany. He was buried in Paris, and his grave became a shrine. His line, the line of Merovech, would rule for nearly 3 centuries. But even then, even in those earliest days, there was always a whisper. That they were more than kings, that their blood was more than royal. Centuries later, that whisper would swell into something louder, stranger. Some would claim the Merovingians carried the blood of Christ himself, that they were not merely kings, but the living grail, the sacred bloodline hidden in plain sight, protected by guardians, hunted by enemies, woven into the deepest myths of Europe. There is no proof of that. There may never be. But there are stories, and stories once told are hard to silence. So imagine, for a moment, standing in that world. The dawn is gray. Mist drifts across a field, soft and cold. A rider approaches, his cloak heavy, his hair long and unbound, glinting like a banner in the weak morning light. The villagers bow their heads as he passes, not just because he is their king, but because there is something in him they cannot name, something that feels older than the throne he sits on, something that feels touched by mystery. The Merovingians are gone now. Their castles are ruins, their tombs are silent, but their story, the whisper of their blood, has never stopped moving. It runs beneath history like an underground river, quiet but unbroken. Some hear it in the myths of sacred kings. Some hear it in the stories of the Templars, as if the knights who rode under the red cross were not just protectors of pilgrims, but guardians of a secret that began long before them, with a queen who stepped into the sea and a child who was more than a man. And now, as you listen, you can hear it too, the whisper of an ancient bloodline, the bloodline before the Templars. 2. Long before the red cross of the Templars was ever lifted into battle, before crusaders rode east and secret societies filled the imagination of Europe, there was another story older, quieter, and cloaked in legend. It is a story that does not begin with knights or castles or maps, but with a whisper, a legend passed from mouth to mouth, a tale so strange it seems almost like something remembered from a dream. It is the story of a bloodline, a dynasty, the first kings of what would one day become France, the Merovingians. To understand their birth, you must first see the world into which they came. Imagine the 5th century after Christ, an age of endings. The Western Roman Empire, that vast and glittering web that had stretched across Europe for centuries, was dying. Its armies had once marched along roads so straight they defied the landscape, their discipline a wall no enemy could breach. But by this time, the legions were gone. The roads cracked and overgrown, the aqueducts silent, the great marble cities hollowed out, echoing only with wind and ghosts. Rome's power was fading into dust, and the lands it once ruled were slipping into chaos. Into that void came the Franks. They were not an empire. They were a people, a loose gathering of tribes who lived on the edge of Rome's fading light. They traded with Romans and raided them. They served in their armies and fought against them. They were both outsiders and inheritors. They were as people of forests and rivers, of iron and oaths, and out of them would rise a dynasty unlike any the world had seen before. But the Merovingians were not born the way other dynasties were. Their birth begins not in history, but in legend. The story goes that there was a queen, the wife of a Frankish chieftain named Clodio. One day, she walked along the gray edge of the North Sea. The wind was sharp, and the horizon was a blur of fog and rolling waves. She stepped into the water, and there she encountered something, someone, or perhaps something beyond either word. Some called it a beast. Some called it a god. Some called it by a name that still sounds strange today. The Kinotaur, the 5-horned creature. The tale does not explain exactly what happened in those waters. The chroniclers who wrote it down centuries later left it in the shadows, as if even to describe it fully would be too much. But the legend tells us this: when the queen returned from the sea, she was carrying a child. That child was Merovec. From his name came the name of the dynasty, the Merovingians. But from his story came something more enduring. The idea that this bloodline was not entirely mortal. Was the Kinotaur real? Was it a remnant of old pagan gods, a symbol of the wild and the unknown? Was it just a coded way to speak of something forbidden, something that could not be named? No one knows. But once the story took root, it never let go. Merovec himself became a leader of the Salian Franks. He was a war chief, a man who led raids and alliances, who fought and ruled in the muddy, fractured world of post-Roman Gaul. But his descendants would turn his name into power. After Merovec came his son, Childeric. Childeric ruled as a king, and though the details of his reign are blurred by time, what we know of him is extraordinary. In 1653, more than 1,000 years after his death, his grave was discovered by chance in Belgium. Inside were treasures that spoke not only of wealth, but of something ceremonial, something almost magical. Golden bees, hundreds of them, tiny and shining. A signet ring, swords, ornaments, weapons. The bees are still a mystery. Some say they were symbols of immortality, of resurrection. Others believe they were emblems of the dynasty itself, silent messengers that carried meaning we can no longer fully read. But what matters is this: when they buried Childeric, they buried him not just as a man, but as a king, and as something more than a king. And then came Clovis. Clovis was Childeric's son, and it was he who would change everything. Clovis took the throne in 481. He was only 15 years old, a boy, but already a ruler in a world where boys had to become men overnight. He inherited a land that was more a patchwork than a kingdom, a tangle of tribes and territories, each with its own loyalties, each with its own dangers. And yet, by the end of his life, Clovis had done what no one before him had done. He had united the Franks. He had defeated rival chieftains, absorbed their lands, and turned a loose collection of tribes into a kingdom that stretched across much of what we now call France and Germany. He was a conqueror, yes, but he was something else too. For in Clovis, the old world and the new world collided. The Franks had worshipped their old gods, spirits of forests, gods of storms and rivers, deities of war. But Clovis married Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who was a Christian, and she whispered to him of another god, the one of Rome and the one of the cross. For a long time, Clovis resisted her faith. But then came a battle, some say. It was at Tolbiac, fierce and desperate. His army was failing, his enemies pressing. And in that moment, Clovis prayed not to his ancestors' gods, but to hers. He promised that if the Christian God gave him victory, he would convert. And the battle turned. Clovis won. True to his word, he kept his promise. On Christmas Day, around the year 496, Clovis was baptized in Reims. The story of that baptism has been told for centuries, and like all stories told for centuries, it has grown into legend. They say the sacred oil ran out as the bishop anointed him, and then a miracle, a white dove descended from heaven, carrying a vial of chrism holy oil. That oil, the story says, would anoint not only Clovis, but the kings of France for centuries afterward, kept as a sacred relic known as the Holy Ampulla. Was it real? Was it a symbol? Perhaps it doesn't matter, because from that moment on, Clovis was not just a warlord with a crown, he was a Christian king, blessed by heaven itself. Yet even with the cross on his banners, the old aura around the Merovingians never faded. They were kings of two worlds, one Christian, one pagan. One written in scripture, the other whispered in legend. They became known by another name, the long-haired kings. Their hair was never cut. In their time, it was not vanity, not fashion. It was something sacred. Their uncut hair was the sign of their right to rule, as much a crown as any made of gold. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his kingship, to make him unfit for the throne. There are stories of kings who were dethroned, not by sword or poison, but by scissors. The snip of a blade, the fall of hair to the ground, and a king became nothing more than a man. And there were other whispers. It was said that the Merovingian kings had a gift that their touch could heal. The royal touch, people called it. Mothers brought their sick children. Peasants came from miles away, hoping for a hand placed on a fevered brow. Was it magic? Was it faith? Was it only the desperate hope of the desperate? Perhaps all of it at once. But belief itself is power, and the Merovingians held that power as surely as they held their swords. By the time Clovis died in 511, the Merovingian kingdom was vast. He was buried in Paris, and his grave became a shrine. For nearly 3 centuries his line would rule. But even in those earliest days, there was always a whisper that they were more than kings, that their blood was more than royal. Centuries later, that whisper would take a new shape. Some would say the Merovingians carried not only the blood of kings, but the blood of Christ himself, that they were the living grail, the sacred bloodline, the secret that would one day be tied to the Templars, to the Priory of Sion, to all the deep myths of Europe. There is no proof of this. There may never be. But proof is not always what survives. Stories survive. And the story of the Merovingians, their strange birth, their uncut hair, their healing touch, their whispered divinity, has never died. So imagine now, if you can, a cold morning in a Frankish village. The mist is thick, the earth damp, the air heavy with smoke from distant fires. A rider approaches. His cloak is dark, his shoulders broad, and from beneath his helm, his hair flows long and uncut, catching the pale light of dawn. The villagers bow their heads, not only because they fear him, not only because they owe him taxes, but because that hair, those strands, tell them something. He is their king. He is something more than a man. The Merovingians are gone now. Their tombs are quiet. Their castles are stone skeletons, but their story, the whisper of their blood, has never stopped. It runs beneath history like a hidden river, feeding myths and dreams and mysteries, waiting for those who still listen closely enough to hear it. And if you listen now, in the quiet, you might hear it too, the whisper of an ancient bloodline, the birth of the Merovingians, the bloodline before the Templars. 3. They were called the long-haired kings, and for the people of their time, that name was more than a description, more than a simple observation about the way their rulers wore their hair. It was a title, a promise, almost a spell. To speak of the long-haired kings was to speak of a dynasty that seemed to stand apart from all others, a dynasty that ruled not just with crowns and swords, but with a strange sacred sign woven into every strand that fell across their shoulders. Their hair was not fashion. It was not vanity. It was something greater, a symbol so powerful that to touch it, to cut it, to violate it in any way was to cut into the very heart of their authority. In the centuries after Clovis united the Franks, the Merovingian dynasty took root, its branches spreading wide. Kings rose, kings fell, territories fractured and rejoined like broken glass, fitted back together again and again. But through every conflict, through every treaty, through every betrayal and battle, there was one thing that remained constant: the long, uncut hair of the Merovingian kings. For the Franks, that hair was more than a mark of kingship. It was the kingship. They believed that in those locks lived something sacred, something given by heaven, or perhaps by something even older, something that stretched back to the strange tale of Merovech and the Kinator, the five-horned creature that had supposedly fathered their line. Whether anyone still truly believed the old legend, the sense that the Merovingians were different, that their blood carried something beyond the ordinary, never disappeared, and their hair became the most visible, tangible reminder of that difference. Imagine a king walking through his hall, his hair loose and gleaming in the torchlight. It is not just hair, it is a banner. It is a declaration that he is chosen, that he is set apart from other men. That hair tells every eye that looks upon him, "This is your ruler, this is your king." And because the meaning of that hair was so deeply woven into their rule, it became their greatest vulnerability. A Merovingian king could not be dethroned in the way other kings could. You could seize his lands, you could take his crown, but if his hair remained untouched, some part of his kingship still clung to him. But take a blade to his hair, cut away those sacred strands, and you stripped away more than his appearance. You stripped away his right to rule. There are stories of kings whose reigns ended not on the battlefield, not with the clang of swords or the crash of gates, but in the quiet snip of shears. A rival, a betrayer, a conqueror might hold a king captive, and instead of striking off his head, simply cut his hair. The transformation was instant and complete. In the eyes of the Franks, a Merovingian without his hair was no longer a king. He was nothing more than an ordinary man, and so the hair was guarded as fiercely as any treasure, because it was treasure. It was crown and banner and shield all at once. The Merovingians ruled in a world of old beliefs and new faiths, a world in which the cross of Christ was spreading across Europe, but the older gods had not fully been forgotten. The people still remembered the spirits of their forests and rivers, the deities who rode storms and shaped harvests. And in that space between the old world and the new, The Merovingians seemed to exist in both. They were Christian kings, baptized and blessed, their line sanctified by the story of Clovis and the holy oil said to have descended from heaven. But they were also something more ancient, something harder to define. Their uncut hair, their healing touch, their strange origin in the tale of a queen, and the Kinator, all of these things made them feel like kings of two worlds, as if they had been chosen not only by the church, but by something deeper, older, and more mysterious. That duality gave them an aura no law could bestow. People saw them not just as rulers, but as symbols. They were not merely men who happened to wear crowns. They were the embodiment of something sacred, and their long hair was proof. The meaning of that proof ran so deep that it shaped the politics of their time. There are records of princes and rivals whose hair was deliberately cut to make them ineligible for the throne. To shear a Merovingian was to neutralize him, to remove him from the game of power without spilling a drop of blood. A crown could be stolen, hair could be cut, and with each fallen lock, the invisible thread that tied that man to the throne unraveled. There are tales of kings sent into monasteries, not as acts of mercy, but of erasure. A monastery was not merely a prison, it was a place where a man's hair would be shorn. A Merovingian stripped of his hair was not a king in exile. He was no king at all. Think for a moment what it must have felt like to live with that weight. To have every strand of hair carry the burden of your throne. To know that one night of betrayal, one pair of hands, one pair of shears, could undo your kingship more completely than any army. It must have been a strange kind of fear, quiet but constant. The knowledge that your power could be undone, not by a sword, but by a pair of blades no larger than a hand. And yet the long-haired kings endured. Their image was striking. When they rode through their lands, their hair caught the light of the sun like a halo, their subjects bowing as much to those shining strands as to the crowns they wore. That hair was not hidden or tied away. It was shown, deliberately, proudly, as a visible sign of what they were. But there was more to their legend than hair. The Merovingians were also said to have a gift. People whispered that they could heal with their touch. The royal touch, they called it. A peasant might bring a child burning with fever, kneel before the king, and beg for his hand. The king would place his fingers on the child's brow, and the people believed that sickness could be lifted. Was it true? Perhaps not. But the belief was true, and belief has a power that even steel cannot match. The Merovingians became healers in the minds of their people, just as they were rulers. They wielded swords, they commanded armies, but they also carried this gentler, stranger power, the idea that their very presence could mend what was broken. This too made them different, and it made their rule stronger. A king who is feared will rule for a time. A king who is believed in can rule for generations. Through the centuries, the Merovingians ruled a kingdom that was constantly shifting lands divided between sons, brothers turning on brothers, realms fractured and mended, the map changing again and again. But through all of it, the hair remained. Even as kings schemed and fought, even as borders blurred and redrew, even as the dynasty's power began to wane, the long hair stayed. It stayed because it had to stay, because without it, the Merovingians were not the Merovingians at all. It is almost absurd to imagine now. The idea that an entire dynasty's claim to the throne could rest on something so fragile, so easy to take. And yet, that fragility was part of what made it powerful. It made their kingship something tangible, something visible. It made their kingship something that could be cut, and therefore something that had to be protected. Imagine standing in a Frankish village on a misty morning. A rider approaches, his cloak dark, his sword at his side. But what you notice first is not the steel, not the crest on his shield. It is his hair, long and shining, tumbling down his back like a river of gold or bronze. You bow, because that hair tells you who he is. It tells you he is not merely a man. It tells you he is your king. The Merovingians lived in that delicate balance, their power woven into strands of hair, their mystique woven into stories that mixed faith and legend. They were Christian kings, yes, kneeling in churches, blessed by bishops. But they were also kings of an older kind, kings whose rule felt like something closer to myth, kings whose very bodies carried the symbols of their right to rule. For centuries they reigned, the long-haired kings, and for centuries their legend grew. Even now, when their dynasty is long gone, when their castles are ruins and their bones are dust, the image endures. The image of a king with hair that could not be cut. A king whose power was not just in his crown, not just in his armies, but in every shining strand that fell across his shoulders. The Merovingians are gone, but that image, the long-haired king, the sacred strands, the strange mixture of fragility and power, still lingers, still whispers. Because some stories do not end when the people in them die. Some stories are woven into the world, as hard to destroy as the belief that gave them life. And so the whisper continues, the whisper of the long-haired kings, a dynasty whose hair was their crown, their shield, and their fate. For there is something about the Merovingians that feels like smoke, real enough to see, but impossible to grasp. You think you know their story, and then it slips through your fingers. They ruled for centuries, and yet their reign feels like a dream. They wore crowns, commanded armies, built alliances, and carved borders, but their power was always wrapped in something more than politics. It was wrapped in mystery, in symbols, in whispers of things half remembered and half believed. It is this aura, this strange shimmering edge between history and legend that people call the Merovingian mystique. Perhaps it began with the way they were born into the world, not just the ordinary birth of kings, but that strange, unsettling tale of a queen stepping into the cold waters of the sea, and the Kinator, the five-horned creature who met her there. Whether the story was true or not almost doesn't matter anymore, because once a story like that takes root, it becomes truth of a different kind. It becomes myth, and myth is a kind of power. It marked the Merovingians as different from the very beginning. People looked at them and saw something they could not name. Were they simply men with crowns, or were they something more? The legend of the Kinator whispered that their blood carried a touch of the divine, perhaps something darker. And once people begin to believe that a dynasty's blood is different, even just a little different, they begin to see everything about that dynasty differently. Their hair was never cut, and that too became part of the mystique. Other kings wore crowns. Merovingian kings wore their hair as if it were a crown in itself. That hair became a shield, a banner, a spell. To cut it was to cut away their power. To see a Merovingian with his long hair gleaming in the sun was to see proof of his kingship with your own eyes. That hair made them seem chosen, as if heaven or the sea had marked them in every shining strand. And there was more. There were whispers that they could heal with a touch, that a Merovingian king's hand on a sick child's forehead could banish illness, that his fingers on a wound could ease the pain. Whether those healings were real didn't matter, because the belief in them was real, and belief creates its own kind of reality. These elements, the strange birth, the long hair, the healing hands, wove together into something larger than history. They made the Merovingians not just rulers, but living symbols. To their people, they were not simply men who held power. They were power. They were proof that something greater was at work, that the world was not just chaos, that there was a thread of the sacred winding through it all. And yet, that same mystique made them fragile. Because if their power rested on these signs, then any crack in those signs could break them. Cut the hair, and the king is no longer a king. cast doubt on the legend, and the aura weakens. The mystique that made them untouchable also made them delicate, like glass, beautiful and powerful when whole, but easily shattered. Still, for centuries they endured. Their mystique was not just in their blood, or their hair, or their touch. It was in the way they carried themselves, in the way they blurred the line between the sacred and the earthly. They were Christian kings, baptized and blessed, kneeling in cathedrals, and yet they seemed to carry an older light, a glow from some forgotten age, when kings were half gods, half men, when power came not from law but from something you could not explain. Think of the people who lived under them, the peasants in the fields, the monks in the monasteries, the nobles in their halls. They must have seen them and felt that same uneasy awe. They must have thought, these are not rulers like others. These are rulers set apart. And that thought is powerful, because when people believe that you are different, they treat you differently. They forgive more, they fear more, they hope more. But there is another layer to the Merovingian mystique, one that was born not in their own time, but in the centuries that came after. Long after the last Merovingian king was gone, long after their hair had been cut and their crowns taken, the whispers did not stop. In fact, they grew louder. There were those who began to say that the Merovingians were not only touched by something strange at their birth, but that they carried something sacred in their blood. Some said it was the blood of Christ himself. The idea sounds shocking, even now. It sounded shocking when it was whispered in the taverns and the cloisters of medieval Europe. But the idea took hold, because it was a story that satisfied a hunger, the hunger for mystery, for connection, for the thought that holy things can leave traces in the world, that a divine thread can run through history, unbroken. The story went like this. Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a child, and that child's bloodline survived, hidden, protected, carried quietly through the centuries. And from that line came the Merovingians. Was it true? Almost certainly not, at least not in any literal sense. But the story was irresistible. It was picked up and told again and again, embroidered into legend, whispered into books and later into novels, retold in conspiracies and coded into symbols. It fed the imagination of secret societies, of Templars, of writers and seekers and dreamers. Because the Merovingians already had the mystique, the strange birth, the long hair, the healing hands, the sense of being more than just men. To say that they carried the blood of Christ was almost a natural step for the legend to take. And so, their mystique grew even after they were gone. The Merovingians became not just a dynasty of kings, but the heart of 1,000 stories of holy bloodlines and lost secrets, stories that would one day find their way into books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the Da Vinci Code. But what makes the Merovingian mystique so powerful is not whether any of those stories are true. It's that they could be, because the Merovingians themselves were already legends. Imagine standing in a Merovingian hall 1,000 years ago. The air smells of smoke and pine, the walls are hung with shields, and in the center sits a king. His hair falls down his back like a river of gold. He raises his hand, and people fall silent. You look at him, and you feel that you are looking at more than a man. That feeling, that sense that there was something more in him than in you, is the mystique. It is the thing that turned the Merovingians from a line of kings into something larger, something that never quite died. Their mystique lives on in ruins and in stories, in symbols and in theories, in whispers about Templars and Grails and hidden codes. It lives on because people want it to, because people need it to. The Merovingians may be gone, their castles broken, their bones turned to dust. But their mystique, the thing that made them more than men, is still here, drifting through history like a low song. And if you listen closely, in the quiet, you might hear it too. The mystique of the Merovingians. All dynasties believe they will last forever. In their brightest days, when their banners fly high and their courts shine with gold and music, the idea of an ending feels impossible, like imagining the sun burning out. And yet, every dynasty ends, every crown slips, every line of kings fades into the gray of history. The Merovingians were no different. For more than 2 centuries, the long-haired kings ruled a kingdom born out of the ruins of Rome. They carried the strange mystique that made them seem more than human, the uncut hair that was a living crown, the healing touch whispered about in villages, the tale of their founder's birth from a queen and the creature in the sea. Their power seemed both earthly and otherworldly, and for a long time that illusion held. But slowly, quietly, the cracks began to show. At first, the cracks were easy to ignore. The kingdom was too vast, too full of promise. But under the surface, the Merovingian line was weakening. Kings divided their lands among their sons, as was the custom, and those sons often turned on one another, brothers becoming rivals, cousins becoming enemies. The unity that Clovis had built began to fracture like a river breaking into streams. One king after another sat on the throne, and slowly they became smaller figures, their power diluted by family feuds and shifting alliances. The great halls where decisions had once been made began to echo with other voices, not the voices of kings, but of the men who stood beside them, men who whispered in their ears, who held their pens, who commanded their armies in their names. These men came to be known as the mayors of the palace. At first, the title sounded harmless, a kind of steward, a manager of the royal household. But the role grew as such roles do. Soon, the mayor was more than a servant. He was the one who truly handled the affairs of the kingdom. The kings, still into their long hair and their crowns, still held court, still carried the aura of sacredness, but the decisions, the power, the control, all of it began to slip into the hands of the mayors. The Merovingian kings became what history would later call rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. It is an unfair phrase, perhaps. They were not lazy in the way the word suggests. Some were weak, yes, some disinterested, some ill-suited to the burden of kingship. But even those who wished to rule found themselves boxed in, their authority quietly drained away by the men who served them. Imagine a Merovingian king in those days. His hair is still long, still sacred. The peasants still bow when he rides past. The old rituals are still performed, and the legend of his healing touch is still whispered in villages. But in his own court, decisions are made without him. His own mayor signs documents in his name, commands armies on his behalf, treats the king himself as a kind of ceremonial figurehead. To the people, little seemed to change. The king was still the king. But inside the halls of power, the shift was clear. The Merovingians were becoming symbols, not rulers. And symbols are beautiful, but they are fragile. As the decades passed, the mayors grew bolder. They were not content simply to rule from the shadows. They began to imagine themselves as kings. The most powerful of these mayors was a man named Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. He was a warrior, a tactician, a man of enormous energy and vision. It was Charles who, in 732, led the Frankish forces to victory at the Battle of Tours, stopping the advance of Muslim armies into Western Europe. That single battle has been called one of the turning points of European history. It cemented Charles's reputation as a savior of Christendom, a defender of the faith. But Charles Martel was not a king. He held no crown. He ruled, but he ruled in the name of Merovingian kings, who had become little more than puppets, their long hair a hollow echo of the power their ancestors had held. The kings still sat on their thrones, but Charles held the scepter in all but name. And then came his son, Pepin the Short. Pipin inherited his father's position as mayor of the palace, but he had no interest in ruling from the shadows. They asked Isis a simple cutting question, a question that would change everything. If a man holds the power of a king, should he not also hold the title? Pipin turned to the Pope for an answer. The Pope, seeking a strong ally, gave him one. The answer was yes. And so, with papal blessing, Pipin the Short deposed the last Merovingian king. That king's name was Childeric III. There is a kind of sadness in that name. Childeric, the last of his line, sat on the throne as a shadow of his ancestors. He had the long hair, yes, for that was still required, the uncut strands that had once been the source of Merovingian strength, but by his time, they were only a formality. The hair had no power left. In 751, Pipin made his move. Childeric was captured, and in a single ritual act, the entire Merovingian dynasty was broken. His hair was cut. It is a small thing. When you think about it, a lock of hair, a blade, a snip. But in that act, centuries of power collapsed. The unbroken line of long-haired kings was severed. Childeric was sent to a monastery, his kingship gone, his bloodline emptied of its magic in the eyes of his people. The Merovingian dynasty was finished. Pipin the Short became king, the first of the Carolingians, the new dynasty that would go on to produce Charlemagne, one of the most famous kings in history. The age of the Merovingians was over, or so it seemed, because even in their decline, even in their fall, the Merovingians did not vanish. Their crowns were taken, their thrones occupied, their last king shorn and exiled, but their story, their mystique, did not cease to I. Perhaps it was because their ending was so symbolic, so ritualistic. They were not swept away by war, not slaughtered in a single night, not burned out in rebellion. They were quietly, ceremonially cut away. The blade touched hair, not flesh. Perhaps that gentleness made it easier for their legend to linger. Or perhaps it was because they had never been just kings. They had been myths. The myths outlived them. The people remembered the long-haired kings, the sacred touch, the strange birth from the sea. They remembered the sense that there had been something different about the Merovingians, something not fully explained, something not fully gone. And in that memory, the bloodline lived on. The Carolingians ruled, and after them others ruled, and the centuries kept turning. But the Merovingians never fully faded. They lived in whispers, in secret genealogies, in the pages of obscure manuscripts, in the symbols carved into stone, in the minds of those who believed that the line of kings was not truly broken, that the blood still flowed. Because how can you kill a whisper? The Merovingians had been dethroned, yes, but they had become something that cannot be dethroned, a legend. 6. There are some stories that refuse to die. They move like roots under the soil, twisting through centuries, sometimes hidden, sometimes breaking the surface, but always alive. The Merovingian story is one of those. Long after their last king fell, long after their castles crumbled and their crowns were taken, the legend of their blood kept flowing, as if it carried something that history itself could not bury. This is the bloodline legend, the story of what people believed, and still believe, about who the Merovingians truly were. It begins, as so many legends do, with a whisper that their blood was not like other blood, that they were not merely kings who ruled because of swords or treaties, but kings who ruled because of what ran in their veins. A whisper that their blood was touched by something more than human. The earliest roots of that whisper stretch back to the strange story of their founder. Merovec, born of a queen who walked into the sea and met the Kinotaur, the five-horned creature. No one knows what the Kinotaur truly was, a sea god from the old pagan world, a beast, half-imagined, or simply a metaphor for something forbidden, something that could not be spoken aloud. The story was told in fragments, half hidden in old chronicles, but it planted a seed, the idea that the Merovingians began with something otherworldly, something that set them apart from ordinary men. For centuries, that was enough. It was enough for their people to believe that the long-haired kings carried something in their blood that made them different. But in time, the legend grew. It deepened. It changed. As the centuries passed, new whispers were woven into the old. Whispers that the Merovingians did not just carry the mark of a sea creature or the touch of some half-forgotten god, but something even greater. Some began to say that the Merovingians carried the blood of Christ himself. It is an idea so bold, so dangerous, that even now it carries a charge. And yet, the legend spread. It took shape in stories told in secret, in manuscripts hidden away, in symbols carved into stone, in books that would be written much later, books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and novels like the Da Vinci Code. The story went like this. Jesus of Nazareth, the figure at the heart of Christianity, did not leave the world childless. He and Mary Magdalene, the woman who followed him to the cross, were bound not only by faith, but by love. They had a child, or perhaps more than one. After the crucifixion, Mary fled the Holy Land, carrying the bloodline with her, across the sea, to Gaul, to what would one day become France. There, in the mists of Europe, that line continued, guarded in secret, hidden from those who would destroy it. And in time, from that line came the Merovingians. Is it true? History says no. There is no proof. But legend is not built on proof. Legend is built on the hunger of those who want it to be true. And people wanted this story to be true. They wanted to believe that the blood of Christ did not vanish into the earth 2,000 years ago, but flowed on, quiet and unbroken, through kings and queens, through generations, through time itself. The Merovingians were the perfect vessel for that belief. They were already strange, already marked, already surrounded by stories of magic and mystery. They had been long-haired kings, kings said to heal with a touch, kings whose founder was born of something that was not quite human. To say that their blood was sacred, to say that their blood was holy, felt almost like the next verse in a song, already being sung. The legend became a tapestry. It wove together threads of faith and fear, history and rumor, fact and imagination. It tied the Merovingians to the Holy Grail, but not the Grail you might be picturing. Not the cup of the Last Supper, the golden chalice sought by knights in shining armor, but another Grail. The Grail as a metaphor, the Grail as a bloodline. The idea was that the Grail was not a thing to drink from. The Grail was a womb, a vessel of life. The Grail was Mary Magdalene, and the bloodline she carried was the Grail's true treasure. The Merovingians, the legend said, were that treasure made flesh. Guardians rose up around them, according to the story, secret brotherhoods sworn to protect the line, to keep it safe from those who would erase it. The Priory of Sion, some whispered. The Knights Templar, others added. It was said that these orders were not only knights and monks, but keepers of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Was there a Priory of Sion? Was there a conspiracy? Or were these names just threads added centuries later to a growing myth? Again, there is no proof. But again, the proof almost doesn't matter. What matters is that the legend never died. Picture it. A monk in a dim library, copying an old manuscript by candlelight, his pen scratching across parchment. He pauses, looks around, and in the margin, he draws a small symbol, a sign that means nothing to most, but everything to those who know. Picture a whisper passed from one generation to the next. The kings are not only kings. Their blood is not only royal. It is a strange thing, how a legend like this survives, how it slips past centuries of change, how it flows through silence, how it emerges again and again every time someone listens closely enough. And so the Merovingians became more than history. They became a question. Who were they, really? Were they simply the first kings of France, men who fought and ruled and died like all kings do? Or were they something else? Something carrying a secret that no sword could cut, no crown could hold. It is tempting to dismiss it all, to say it is only story, only dream. But then you see how persistent it is. You see how it keeps returning. You see how it has been retold in every age, reshaped for every ear, from the cloisters of medieval monks to the pages of modern books, from the whispers of pilgrims to the scripts of films. The Bloodline legend has endured because it gives something to those who believe it. It gives meaning. It suggests that history is not just chaos, not just kings killing kings and empires rising and falling. It suggests there is a thread running through it all, a thread of the sacred, a thread of destiny. And perhaps that is the true power of the legend, not whether it is true, but what it makes people feel. Imagine a village in the early Middle Ages, a Merovingian king riding through, his hair long and bright, the people bowing as he passes. Some bow because they must. Some bow because they fear him. But some bow because they believe, because they think they are seeing not just a man, not just a king, but something more. That belief is the root of the Bloodline legend. It did not start with the Da Vinci Code. It did not start with medieval manuscripts or Templar whispers. It started with that feeling, that sense that the Merovingians carried something special, something sacred, something you could not see, but could somehow feel. And from that feeling grew the story. A story of holy blood, a story of a hidden line, a story of guardians and secrets, of codes and symbols, of truths too great and too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The Merovingians are long gone now. Their thrones have been emptied, their bones laid in the earth. But the Bloodline legend has never been buried. It moves quietly, like a river under stone. Some say it is all myth, a beautiful, impossible story. Others say it is the greatest secret in history. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps that is why it still whispers. Because some part of us wants it to be true. Some part of us wants to believe that the sacred is still here, that it flows not in relics behind glass, but in the veins of men and women, unseen. And that is the heart of the legend. Not whether the Merovingians truly carried the blood of Christ, but the idea that they might have. Because that idea has a power all its own, a power strong enough to outlive a dynasty, to outlive an empire, to outlive time itself. And as long as that idea is whispered, as long as it is believed, the legend of the Bloodline will never end. 7. Some legacies live in stone. Some are written in books. Some are carried in songs. And some are hidden, passed like a secret from one generation to the next. Whispered rather than shouted, woven into rituals, symbols, and blood. The Merovingians, the long-haired kings, left behind more than crowns and bones and fading castles. They left behind something harder to define, something harder to destroy. People call it the Merovingian Code. What is a code? It is a thing you must decipher, a thing that is not meant to be understood at first glance. A code is a message wrapped in mystery, and the Merovingian legacy is nothing if not mysterious. Their story has always been more than history. From the very beginning, there was something in it that felt hidden, something that had to be looked at sideways, as though staring directly at it would make it vanish. The queen walking into the cold sea, the Kinotaur rising from the waves, the child, Merovech, born from that union of legend, the kings with hair that could not be cut, the hands said to heal the sick, the whispers of holy blood. All of it together feels like a code, symbols that hint at a meaning just out of reach. Some say the code was their bloodline itself, that their very existence carried an unspoken truth, that the story of the Merovingians was not just the story of kings and wars, but a cipher pointing to something greater. Others say the code was their belief, or perhaps the belief others had in them, The Merovingians ruled not just because they had armies, but because they had an aura. Their people looked at them and felt there was something different, something set apart, something sacred. That feeling was never written into law, but it was as binding as any law could be. That too was part of the code, the unspoken agreement that the Merovingians were more than men. Imagine it like a language you cannot read, but can feel. The long hair was a letter. The healing touch was a letter. The baptism of Clovis, the dove descending with holy oil. More letters. The strange tale of the Kinotaur, the whispers of bloodlines, the rumors of grails, all more letters. Put them together, and you sense that they are spelling something. But what? For centuries, people have tried to read that code. In monasteries, monks copied and recopied chronicles, sometimes leaving small, strange marks in the margins. Tiny hints, maybe, or maybe just their own secret amusements. In the courts of Europe, genealogists traced and retraced royal lines, whispering about who might still carry the blood. In later centuries, seekers of mysteries, members of secret societies, writers and dreamers all tried to make sense of the same puzzle. Was the Merovingian code a literal set of instructions hidden somewhere in an illuminated manuscript or an ancient tomb? Was it a spiritual truth disguised as a family story? Was it a myth waiting for someone to turn the key and unlock it? Perhaps it is all of those things. Or perhaps the code is not meant to be solved at all. Perhaps the code is the mystery itself. The invitation to look deeper, to wonder, to feel that there is more to history than the facts written in textbooks. Because that is the strange power of the Merovingians. They make you feel that something is hidden, that beneath every ordinary thing there might be an extraordinary meaning. Think of their long hair. To most dynasties, hair would be just hair. But for the Merovingians, it was sacred. It was kingship. Cut it, and a king became nothing. That rule was never written into stone tablets. It was never carved into the walls of a palace. And yet, it might as well have been. Everyone knew it. Everyone obeyed it. That was part of the code. Think of their healing touch. Maybe the healings were real, maybe they were not. But the belief was real. People brought their sick children and begged for the king's hand. The king would place his fingers on a brow, and hope itself became a kind of medicine. That too was part of the code, the way faith can turn into power, the way belief can make something true simply because enough people feel it to be true. Think of the legend of their birth. A queen walking into the sea. The Kinotaur rising from the depths. A child conceived from that meeting. That story is strange, dreamlike, almost absurd, and yet it endured, carried for centuries. Why? Because it said something that could not be said any other way, that the Merovingians were different, that their blood was different, that their rule came not just from swords and treaties, but from something deeper, something older, something harder to explain. All of these things, the hair, the touch, the legend, are pieces of the code. And then there are the whispers that came later, the whispers of holy blood, the whispers that the Merovingians carried the bloodline of Christ. That story has been told so many times that it feels almost familiar now. But think of how wild, how shocking it must have felt when it was first whispered in the dark, when it was first hinted at in an old manuscript, when it was first passed from one pair of lips to another. If that story is part of the code, then it is the most dangerous piece of all, because it changes everything. If it were true, even in part, then the Merovingians would not just be kings, they would be something far greater. And if it is not true, if it is only legend, then it still has power, because enough people believed it. That is what the Merovingian code truly teaches, that belief is stronger than fact, that a story, once told, can outlast empires, that a whisper can become a crown. Picture the centuries after their dynasty fell. Their last king, Childeric III, shorn of his sacred hair, sent away to live in exile. his line seemingly broken. Another family took the throne, the Carolingians, and after them came others. But the Merovingians did not vanish. Their blood did not stop. And neither did the code. It slipped underground, into whispers and symbols, into the margins of history, waiting for those who could still feel it. A monk draws a bee in the corner of a manuscript, the golden bees that were buried with Childric, the bees that have always been strange and unexplained. Is it decoration? Or is it a sign, a reminder of something only some will notice? A genealogist traces a line of descent and pauses, seeing a name that does not belong, a connection that should not exist, but does. Does he write it down, or does he keep it to himself? A knight kneels in a candlelit chapel, swearing an oath not only to God, but to something else, a line, a secret, a duty to protect something no one dare speak aloud. The code continues, not as words carved in stone, but as acts, as gestures, as traditions so old no one remembers where they began. Even now, the code is still here. You can feel it when you hear the name Merovingian. It feels heavier than it should. It feels like a key. The code is in the way the story has survived, reshaped and retold for more than 1,000 years. It is in the way modern books and films pick up the same threads, weaving them into new patterns, but always returning to the same feeling, that something is hidden here, something we are meant to see, but only if we look closely. What is the Merovingian code? Perhaps it is not a single thing. Perhaps it is not a single truth. Perhaps it is the idea that there is meaning behind the world. Perhaps it is the reminder that kings and bloodlines and dynasties are not just politics, but symbols that carry the weight of dreams, of faith, of longing. Perhaps the code is an invitation to listen for whispers, to look for signs, to believe, even just for a moment, that the sacred might still flow quietly through the veins of history. The Merovingians have been gone for more than 1,000 years. Their long hair has been cut, their thrones have been taken, their castles are ruins. But the code remains, because the code was never just theirs. It became ours. It became the part of us that needs mystery, that hungers for hidden truths, that wants to believe that history is not only blood and war and dust, but a map drawn in symbols, a story with secrets still waiting to be found. And so the Merovingian code lives on, not in palaces, not in crowns, but in the quiet spaces between history and legend. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it, a soft murmur, a thread of meaning, a reminder that some stories are not meant to end. 8. There are stories in history that roar like thunder, that crash into the world and leave their marks in stone and steel. And then there are stories that move like a breeze, so soft, so faint, that you might not even feel them at first. The tale of the Merovingians is like that. It does not shout, it whispers. For hours, we have wandered through the paths of their legend kings, with hair like golden rivers, queens who carried rumors like perfume, a bloodline said to touch the sacred and the strange. And now, as the night deepens and the world around you grows quiet, we return to that whisper, and we ask, what does it really mean? The Merovingians ruled long ago. Their dynasty faded more than 1,000 years in the past. Their last king was dethroned, his long hair shorn, his crown taken. And yet, their name endures. It lingers in books, in films, in whispered theories, in the minds of those who still believe there is something more beneath the surface of history. Why? Why does this story hold us? Why do we lean closer when we hear the word Merovingian? Perhaps it is because we are drawn to mystery. The Merovingians were not just kings, they were symbols. They carried with them a sense of something older, something deeper than politics and power. Their legends say they were born of the sea, that their line began when a queen was touched by a creature not entirely human, the mysterious Kinotaur. Myth says this union left its mark on their blood, making it somehow different, somehow other. Is that true? History would shake its head, but the whisper stays. Because even if the Kinotaur never existed, even if the sea never shaped their blood, people believed it did. And sometimes, belief is stronger than truth. The Merovingians became the long-haired kings. Their hair was more than fashion, it was their crown. To cut it was to cut away their power. To touch it without permission was to insult something sacred. There are stories of kings deposed by a single snip of the blade. Strange, isn't it? That such power could be tied to something so simple. But perhaps that is what made it powerful, the idea that their strength, their authority, their very right to rule was woven into every strand. When their dynasty fell, when their crowns were stolen and their locks were shorn, one might think the story should have ended. But it didn't. Because blood doesn't stop flowing just because a crown falls. That is the heart of the Merovingian legend. The idea that their bloodline did not die with their throne. Some believe that blood carried something sacred. Some claim it carried the blood of Christ himself, that Mary Magdalene bore a child, and that child's descendants became the Merovingians. Others scoff. They call it fantasy, a beautiful story told in the dark. But whether true or not, that idea took root. It grew like ivy across the centuries, curling into the myths of the Holy Grail, tangling with the legends of the Templars, winding its way into the secret societies that still raise their banners today. Maybe that is what we are really chasing when we talk about the Merovingian code, not a cipher in ink, not a secret carved into stone, but a dream of connection. A dream that maybe somewhere there is a thread that ties the holy and the human together, that turns kings into something more than kings. It is comforting in a strange way. We live in a world of sharp edges, of facts and dates, of wars and empires. But when we talk about the Merovingians, we are talking about something softer, something half in shadow. We are talking about the way a story can move through blood. Think of it. Centuries after their fall, the Merovingians still stir imaginations. Books are written, films are made. Tourists visit their graves, wondering if the soil holds secrets. And in every retelling, the line between history and legend blurs a little more. Did their blood really matter? Did it carry the Grail? Did it carry magic? Or was it simply human but wrapped in enough mystery to feel divine? Perhaps we will never know, and maybe that is the point. Because sometimes the beauty of a story is not in its answers, it's in its questions. The Merovingians invite us to dream of kings who were more than kings, to dream of bloodlines that carried whispers of heaven, to dream of a time when a single lock of hair could hold the weight of a kingdom. And maybe, as you drift deeper into the calm of this night, you can feel that dream too. The dream of a bloodline that may have ended, or may not have. The dream of secrets that may be nothing more than stories, or maybe something more. The dream of the Merovingians, still flowing, like a quiet river beneath the soil of history. Because that is what they left behind, not just a dynasty, not just ruins, but a dream. And tonight that dream is yours to keep. And so, our journey drifts to its end. We have wandered through the mists of time, tracing the stories of the Merovingian kings, with long hair like rivers, whispers of holy blood, a legacy that flowed long before the red cross of the Templars ever touched a battlefield. We have listened to the myths, the truths, and the places in between, where history becomes dream, and dream becomes history. Some of what we shared tonight is written in stone. Some of it lives only in legend. But perhaps that is the beauty of these stories, that they invite us to wonder, to close our eyes and imagine a time when kings, might carry secrets in their blood, and when a whisper from the past could travel centuries to reach us here, in this quiet moment. If you are listening as you drift towards sleep, let these stories settle softly around you. Let the names, the legends, the gentle rhythm of history carry you into rest. Because history is not only dates and battles, it is a lullaby too, if you listen closely enough. Thank you for letting this story keep you company tonight. Thank you for opening your mind to the old whispers, for walking the quiet roads of memory with me. If you wish to travel further, there are more stories waiting, more mysteries to unfold, but for now, it is time to rest. May your night be calm, your dreams be light, and may the whispers of history bring you peace.